hearing on Capitol Hill, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett goes head-to-head with Elon Musk over the systemic suppression of minority voices on X, impacting over 42 million users and tied to a $3.2 billion market shift. Musk tries to discredit her with sarcasm and outdated tweets, but just 19 minutes in, Crockett flips the entire hearing with leaked internal emails and a voice recording no one can deny. If the richest man in the world built his power by silencing the truth, what happens when the truth finally silences him? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Inside Capitol Hill's most restricted chamber, the air felt weaponized. This wasn't just another hearing, it was a battlefield wrapped in silence. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a warning siren. No reporters, no cameras, no live stream. Just power, pressed tight between four marble walls. The hearing had been classified as level red, the highest level of congressional secrecy, meant only for the gravest threats to democratic infrastructure. And yet, Elon Musk sat with one leg casually draped over the other, as if he were hosting a podcast, not answering for allegations of digital authoritarianism. On the opposite side, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, flanked by two silent aides, remained still, chin lifted, lips set like steel. She wasn't just present, she was primed. Every second before her first question felt like the fuse of a grenade, counting down in slow surgical tension. Behind Crockett, 12 members of the House Oversight Committee lined the bench, their eyes flicking between Elon and stacks of sealed files marked confidential X algorithm leak. The accusations weren't vague. Musk was being held to answer for shadow censorship, algorithmic bias, and platform manipulation during 2 election cycles. But even now, with sworn testimony minutes away, Musk looked bored. He let out a sigh, glancing at his phone until a marshal ordered it off. The arrogance wasn't subtle, it was the point. Jasmine knew the game. This wasn't just about evidence, it was about power, and she was expected to fold. She remembered the backroom whispers before entering, how lobbyists had swarmed committee members, how private messages warned her to go easy or risk losing future cooperation from Silicon Valley. One senior senator even pulled her aside and said, "Don't pick a war with the world's richest man unless you're ready to bleed." But that's exactly what she came to do. Because Musk hadn't just censored random hashtags, his algorithm had quietly strangled black political movements, silenced whistleblowers, and erased the digital footprints of real-world suffering. All under the guise of content moderation. Jasmine wasn't there to ask. She was there to indict. He smirked, slow, deliberate, as if the silence following Crockett's question confirmed what he already believed, that this room, this hearing, this woman in front of him posed no threat. Only irritation. He leaned back in his seat with theatrical ease, like a king settling into his throne before issuing a casual decree. "Maybe law school didn't teach her AI," Elon Musk said, just loud enough for the entire chamber to hear, and just soft enough to pretend it was a joke. The line didn't land like humor, it landed like strategy, the kind of jab that isn't meant to provoke laughter, but to plant doubt. Doubt in the minds of his critics, doubt in the legitimacy of her presence, doubt in the authority of any woman who dares question the architect of the algorithm. A few aides behind him, a polished line of suits with devices open and fingers poised, glanced at each other. Their smirks were immediate, manufactured, as if they'd rehearsed the moment, timed the response. They chuckled, short and sharp, the sound of controlled mockery. Not spontaneous, not real, just performative applause for a man who expected adoration every time he opened his mouth. Jasmine Crockett didn't lift her head. Her right hand moved across her legal pad in slow, firm strokes. No tension in her jaw, no visible reaction. She simply wrote, and yet the discipline it took to stay composed, to deny him the satisfaction of even a flinch, was monumental. She knew the game. He wasn't addressing her intellect. He was targeting her existence. This wasn't about policy, it was about pecking order. And he was making damn sure the room knew who he believed sat above whom. But Musk wasn't done. "You see, Congress still thinks content moderation is censorship," he said, now turning slightly to address the rest of the panel, his voice taking on that smug, polished tech evangelist cadence. In reality, X is the last free marketplace of ideas. If we start letting politicians like Ms. Crockett decide what qualifies as truth, we may as well burn the Constitution. His tone didn't rise. It dripped, slow, venomous, self-satisfied. Then came the blade, delivered with surgical arrogance. She doesn't want fairness. She wants obedience. And just like that, the air shifted. The room had already been tense, but now it split in two. On the right side, subtle smirks, quiet nods, arms folded in implicit approval. On the left, motionless disapproval, fury held behind clenched jaws and narrowed eyes. The silence became weaponized, no longer neutral. It was complicity for some, constraint for others. But for Jasmine Crockett, it was a crucible. She sat still, her pen pausing just long enough to let the insult settle where it needed to settle. Not in her, but in the record. She'd heard versions of this before. At law school, in the Texas courts, on national television. Different men, same condescension. They questioned not just her ideas, but her legitimacy, her very right to challenge them, as if being a black woman in power was, in itself, a provocation. Musk's words weren't just dismissive, they were calculated, coded in a language of elitism and thinly veiled racism. He had reduced her years of legal experience, her elected office, her lived understanding of systemic bias into a punchline about artificial intelligence. But Crockett didn't respond. Not yet. She knew the weight of stereotypes better than anyone in that chamber. She knew that if she met insult with immediate fury, the headlines would be about her anger, not his arrogance. That the story wouldn't be about algorithms that bury black voices or platforms that amplify hate. It would be about how unprofessional she had been. And that was the real injustice, being expected to carry grace in the face of degradation. To stay composed when a man with unimaginable influence makes a mockery of your voice on the record. But what Musk didn't understand, what he never could, is that silence is not defeat. Sometimes it's the tightening of a bowstring. And Crockett's arrow was coming. And then, without raising her voice, without shifting in her seat, Jasmine struck. Does your algorithm filter content based on race, Mr. Musk? The question landed like a stun grenade, not shouted, not embellished, just cold, clean, and impossible to ignore. Her tone was devoid of emotion, and that made it hit harder, like a prosecutor dropping the first charge in a case everyone else had tiptoed around. The oxygen in the room seemed to tighten. Committee members sat back slightly, as if they weren't sure whether to lean into the question or brace for what might follow. Musk hesitated, not overtly, but enough. A fractional pause, a flicker in his eyes, a momentary stillness in the fingers that had been tapping restlessly against the table. For a man who prided himself on immediate answers, the delay said everything. He glanced at his lawyer. No words were exchanged, but the tension between them was like a current. Then Musk turned his head slightly toward the chairman before locking eyes again with Jasmine. His expression settled into something practiced, neutral on the surface, but heavy with condescension underneath. Well, he began, stretching the syllable like it bought him time, race isn't a direct parameter in the input layer of our moderation neural network. We rely on behavioral heuristics, sentiment tagging, and trust indicators, none of which are racially defined. The system learns from user engagement trends and community flagging behavior over time. So technically speaking, it's agnostic. The words were dense, deliberate. They filled the room with the illusion of precision while offering no real answer at all. It wasn't an explanation. It was an evasion written in code, crafted to exhaust rather than inform. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't interrupt. But beneath her stillness was something electric, something you could feel if you looked closely. The way her eyes narrowed just enough to register insult without giving away rage. She had heard this kind of deflection before, not just in tech hearings, in red-line mortgage applications, in random traffic stops, in boardrooms where equity was promised but never budgeted. It was always the same script, just with fancier words. We don't discriminate, we just measure behavior. But behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is shaped by perception, and perception, when trained on biased data, is discrimination wearing a mask. What Musk called agnostic, she recognized as weaponized neutrality. The kind that flags an activist's post as extreme while letting hate speech slide because it drives engagement. The kind that silences black grief but amplifies white grievance. The kind that hides behind algorithms the same way institutions have always hidden behind policy to avoid responsibility. And still Jasmine said nothing, because in that silence, she was making him sit with the absurdity of his own defense, making everyone in that chamber realize that sometimes the loudest sound in the room is the lie you let echo. She let his evasive answer hang in the air just long enough to collapse under its own emptiness, then calmly, methodically, turned the knife. Without so much as a shift in tone, Jasmine reached into her case and withdrew a folded document, 2 pages thick, printed on cream paper, the kind that carries weight even before it's read. She unfolded it slowly, deliberately, giving the room time to see the X-Corp letterhead, the timestamp, the thread of internal names, familiar names. The highlighter marks glared like wounds. And then, her voice as even as a scalpel, she read aloud. "This is an internal email from one of your senior content policy managers," she said. It reads, and I quote, "Content related to black voices should be downranked in visibility due to political sensitivity." Then she placed the email face up in front of her mic. No flourish, no dramatic pause. Just quiet force. The silence that followed was total. Not the silence of confusion or awkwardness, but the kind that happens when everyone in the room realizes they are no longer sitting in a hearing. They're sitting in a reckoning. For a few seconds, the only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights. Aide after aide beside Musk tensed like startled prey. One leaned toward a legal pad, scribbling in a panic. Another lifted a hand to their earpiece and murmured urgently. A junior attorney to Musk's left clenched her jaw and turned visibly pale. Whatever internal playbook they had walked in with no longer applied. But the camera, if one had been allowed in that room, would have stayed on Musk. His posture stiffened. Not much, but enough. The smirk was gone. Replaced not by fear, not yet, but something colder. Calculation. You could see it. The gears behind his eyes turning too fast. He was searching for a loophole in real time. But even he knew this wasn't just a PR problem. This wasn't a headline. This was a documented directive. It said that black voices weren't algorithmically overlooked. They were intentionally buried. Jasmine didn't lean back. She didn't smile. There was no satisfaction in truth this ugly. Instead, she tapped the paper gently with her pen. Once. A sound so soft it barely registered. But in that silence, it echoed like thunder. Because that tap meant, look at it, don't look away. This is real. And everyone in that room knew it. What she had laid on the table wasn't just a policy. It was proof that freedom of speech had been weaponized, used to elevate the voices of the powerful, while systematically lowering the volume on anyone deemed too political, too black, or simply too inconvenient. This wasn't about platforms anymore. It was about principle. And Elon Musk had just been caught standing on the wrong side of both. The tap of Jasmine's pen on that printed email had barely faded when she shifted forward in her chair. Posture still composed, but energy shifting, tightening, like a coiled spring ready to snap. The silence around her hadn't just thickened, it had turned volatile. Everyone in the room could sense it. Something bigger was coming. She didn't reach for permission. She didn't build suspense. She simply moved. "I'd like to move to the audio portion of the evidence," she said, her voice low, unwavering, stripped of any theatricality. "I have a sound recording." Gasps didn't break out. This room was too seasoned, too political, too practiced for that. But the shift was undeniable. Spines straightened. Pens stopped moving. One of Musk's attorneys leaned forward like a man anticipating a car crash. Jasmine, unaffected, reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small black USB drive. Unlabeled, ordinary, the kind of thing that disappears in drawers and pockets. But today it held the weight of a courtroom verdict. She didn't raise it like a trophy. She simply held it steady at eye level. "This recording," she continued, "was provided anonymously by a former engineer at X, who resigned under pressure after raising internal objections to content suppression policies. Her tone wasn't dramatic. It was restrained, purposeful. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to reveal. Every person in that room understood what she was doing and what it cost. To present whistleblower evidence in a sealed federal chamber without protection from party politics or media spin was to place your entire career, your safety even, on the line. But Crockett didn't blink. She plugged the USB into the audio terminal before her with a precision that felt ceremonial. Then for just a second, she glanced across the table. Not at the chairman, not at the staffers, but directly at Elon Musk. Their eyes locked. His jaw tightened. A flicker of something, uncertainty, resentment, crossed his face. Jasmine didn't blink. And then she pressed play. A half second of static, then clarity. Elon Musk's voice came through the speakers, unmistakably his, clear, firm, irritated. Keep the George Floyd hashtags buried. Wait for engagement to dip before pulling them entirely. No noise, no coughs, no cross-chatter. It was the voice of a decision made behind a closed door, spoken with the casual cruelty of someone discussing a marketing metric, not a human life. There was no context needed, no editing to distort intent. Just a simple, flat directive, cold enough to chill the blood of anyone listening. And in that moment, the air in the room collapsed into itself. It wasn't silence anymore. It was something heavier, a moral gravity that pulled at every person present. Not a single soul looked away. Because now they couldn't. Because now the lie had a voice, and it belonged to Elon Musk. The final word from the recording had barely dissolved into silence when Elon Musk began to shift. Not dramatically, not in protest, just enough to reveal the crack beneath the armor. His shoulders rolled slightly. One hand tugged at his shirt cuff, the other flexed against the armrest like he was trying to release something invisible pressing down on him. But it was too late. The room had heard his voice, and no matter how many advisors or lawyers sat behind him, nothing could unsay what he'd ordered. That's when the panic surfaced, not from him directly, but from his team. A young legal advisor seated just behind Musk surged forward in his seat, his face flushed and his voice trembling as he tried to override the room's momentum. Madam Chair, this recording is inadmissible. This is a violation of procedural. He never finished the sentence. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink, didn't shift in her chair. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she lowered it, each word sharp, deliberate, and unshakably calm, like a judge issuing a verdict. You're interrupting a sitting member of Congress during a federal hearing? Then her voice dropped even deeper, resonating like a gavel across marble. We are listening to evidence of a crime. The impact was immediate. The young lawyer froze mid-sentence, his mouth still slightly open. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward him, not in anger, but in disbelief, like someone had just yelled during a funeral. Slowly, visibly rattled, he sank back into his seat without another word. Even the chairman, whose earlier caution had suggested a desire to keep this hearing tidy and politically palatable, remained silent. He knew, as did everyone else now, that the threshold had been crossed. This wasn't political theater anymore. This was accountability, and Jasmine Crockett had seized it with terrifying precision. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't grandstand. She simply turned her gaze back to Elon Musk, calm as stone, her voice now a quiet force holding the entire room hostage. Because she knew what men like him counted on: chaos, deflection, legal fog. But there was no fog left. The smoke had cleared, and underneath it stood the truth, uncomfortable, unpolished, undeniable. The air was still recovering from the weight of Jasmine's last words. No one spoke. No one dared. For a moment, the hearing chamber felt less like a place of debate and more like a place where something irreversible had just been exposed. Something that could not be walked back, not explained away with PR language or legalese. And that was when Elon Musk broke. It wasn't loud at first, just the subtle shift of his body, like someone trying to shake off a weight he could no longer carry. His knuckles whitened against the table's edge. His jaw flexed. And then, in a flash of motion too fast to be rehearsed, he pushed back his chair and stood. Violently. The sharp screech of metal legs scraping across marble sliced through the room like a warning shot. His composure, the armor he had worn for nearly the entire hearing, shattered in real time. And what was left behind wasn't brilliance or control. It was fury, unvarnished, unguarded. "This isn't a hearing," he snapped, voice rising in pitch and volume, like a dam finally cracking. "It's a witch hunt orchestrated by the left." The words slammed into the room. It wasn't just the volume, it was the tone. This wasn't strategy, it was instinct. The kind of response you give when you've run out of cards but still want to flip the table. And in that single outburst, he exposed exactly what Jasmine had known all along. He wasn't used to being questioned. He was used to being obeyed. Now every eye in the room was locked on him, not out of respect, but out of concern. Because what stood before them wasn't the composed CEO of a trillion-dollar empire. It was a man unraveling under the heat of his own record. Musk leaned forward with a burst of urgency and flipped open his personal laptop, its screen casting a cold blue glow across the table. His fingers moved fast, erratic. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the rapid clacking of keys. The display flickered, then stabilized. And suddenly, there it was, a collage of digital fragments, arranged like a political smearboard. He turned the laptop toward the committee. On screen were social media posts from nearly a decade ago. Grainy screenshots of Jasmine Crockett's personal Twitter account, a blog post headline from her grassroots activism days, even a freeze frame from a long-forgotten interview where she had spoken about corporate data surveillance. Words circled in red: billionaire recklessness, tech platforms addicted to control, Silicon Valley's untouchables. "This," Musk declared, stabbing his finger toward the screen like a prosecutor presenting Exhibit A, "is proof that Congresswoman Crockett has hated me long before today. This isn't oversight. This is personal." The room didn't gasp. It froze. A tremor of uncertainty rippled through the committee. Not because they believed him, but because they recognized the tactic. This was classic power, not answering an accusation, but redirecting the light. From what he'd done to who was daring to expose it. And for Jasmine, this was familiar ground. This wasn't just a billionaire trying to humiliate her. It was a man, backed into a corner, weaponizing her past, her voice, her advocacy, her truth, as a way to delegitimize her present, to make the room forget the evidence, the email, the audio, the directives, to make them instead focus on a woman who had once dared to speak out before she had a title. It wasn't just unfair. It was textbook. And worst of all, it wasn't even for the committee. It was for the cameras that weren't there. It was for the sound bites that would leak, the headlines that would run. Crockett biased from the beginning? He was already writing them, live, in real time. He wasn't defending himself. He was preparing the counterattack. Because for men like Musk, being held accountable is never a crisis. It's just another algorithm to control. And Jasmine Crockett had just disrupted it. The room was still reeling from Musk's deflection, the digital images of old tweets still glowing on his laptop like flickers of smoke from a fire he was desperately trying to ignite. His voice, filled with accusation, had tried to reroute the hearing, away from the crimes in his own record, toward the perceived bias of the woman daring to hold him accountable. But Jasmine Crockett didn't look shaken. She looked still. That stillness wasn't silence. It was control. She knew this moment by heart. She had lived it 1,000 times in 1,000 rooms. When the facts were on her side, but the attack turned personal, when her intellect was disregarded and her passion was spun as prejudice. When men like Musk, powerful, untouchable, attempted to reduce her to a caricature of bitterness, because that was easier than facing what she actually represented, truth in public view. So she stood, slowly, with intention, with the silence of the room pressing into her back like a tidal force. The scrape of her chair on the marble floor sounded almost ceremonial, like the strike of a match just before the blaze. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't falter. She rose with the calm of someone who had waited long enough, who had been dismissed long enough, who now refused to stay seated while history tried to rewrite her. She met Musk's gaze head on, and when she spoke, her voice did not tremble. It rang. "You're wrong," she said, each word cut clean, deliberate, undeniable. "I don't hate you. I hate abuse. I hate when power is used to silence an entire generation." The room didn't just hear her, it felt her. Every syllable carried not just her truth, but the weight of those who'd been shadow banned, muted, throttled, digitally erased, all in the name of keeping things politically safe or algorithmically neutral. Musk had tried to turn this into a vendetta, but Jasmine had turned it into a mirror. And now all he could see was himself, stripped of myth, exposed for what he had built, a machine that punished dissent and called it free speech. And she wasn't done, not by a long shot. But in that moment, she didn't need to say another word, because the balance of power had shifted, not by force, not by wealth, but by a truth that refused to be filtered. The silence after Jasmine's words wasn't just silence, it was a vacuum. It pulled the oxygen from the room, pressed against every chest, left no space for spin or rebuttal. Even Elon Musk, who had spent the better part of the hearing dominating the tempo, now sat motionless. His mouth was tight, his gaze locked forward, but the confident veneer had cracked. Around him, his lawyers exchanged silent, anxious glances. They could feel it. Something was shifting. Then the sound that broke it, click. A door at the far end of the chamber eased open. Not the main entrance, but the discreet staff corridor typically used only during private proceedings. Heads turned. Committee aides leaned in. The chairman's brow furrowed as a staffer moved quickly to his side and whispered something into his ear. A sealed file folder was passed between them, and after a long, tense beat, the chairman nodded slowly. "The committee has approved an emergency witness," he said, his voice heavy with consequence. "Please welcome Caitlin Rivera." There was no fanfare, no dramatic music, just a woman walking alone into a storm that had been building all morning. Caitlin Rivera, former head of ethics at X. She was dressed plainly, no blazer, no designer heels, no makeup layered for cameras that weren't there. Just a pale blue blouse, dark slacks, and a messenger bag slung across one shoulder. She moved with a quiet resolve, her expression unreadable but focused. She didn't walk like someone seeking attention. She walked like someone who had finally decided enough was enough. Musk stiffened. His eyes followed her across the room with barely disguised tension. His fingers tapped once, twice on the tabletop before curling into his palm. It wasn't panic exactly. It was recognition. He knew who she was. And more importantly, he knew what she knew. Rivera took her seat at the witness table. The oath was administered. Her right hand raised, her voice steady. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." The moment didn't feel procedural. It felt personal. Everyone knew the stakes had just shifted from policy to confession. She folded her hands in front of her and leaned forward slightly into the microphone. No notes, no hesitation. "I was the lead on algorithmic ethics at X until I resigned last year. I was summoned to a closed-door meeting with Mr. Musk and two senior engineers. During that meeting, I was directly instructed to optimize the platform's algorithm to suppress hashtags related to police brutality protests." She didn't glance at Musk yet. She kept her eyes on the committee, on the people she knew would decide whether truth still meant anything in this building. She paused just for breath, not for drama, then continued, voice unwavering. His exact words were, "It's hurting the stock. Bury it until the heat dies down." The room went still, not just quiet but paralyzed. There was no scribbling of notes, no shifting in seats, not even a cough from the back rows. What she had said wasn't shocking because it was unbelievable. It was shocking because it wasn't. They had all suspected, whispered, speculated. But this was different. This was testimony, under oath, with a name, a title, a date, and a directive. And it had come not from a journalist or a leak, but from a woman who had sat inside the heart of the machine. A woman who had been responsible for ethical oversight and now stood before Congress to admit that oversight had been crushed under the weight of profit. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't nod or interject. She simply watched, silent, steady. Her presence alone a counterweight to the power Musk had once thought insurmountable. Across the table, Musk didn't move either, but his stillness had changed. This was no longer calculated calm. This was coiled tension, the kind that comes when someone realizes the room has turned, when the walls start closing and the script starts failing. Rivera remained composed, but you could see the effort it took. Her shoulders were drawn back, but her hands trembled faintly at the knuckles. Not out of fear, but the strain of carrying a truth too long. She had been the person tasked with guiding one of the most powerful platforms on Earth toward ethical standards. And she had been told, clearly, unequivocally, that those standards would always take a backseat to Wall Street. She had obeyed for a time, until she couldn't, until the dissonance between what she knew and what she was being ordered to ignore had finally cracked her silence. And now she had chosen this room, this moment, to break it. Her words had stripped the case bare. No longer was it about speculation or accusation. No longer was it about Crockett's old tweets or political motivations. It was about this: a CEO, one of the most powerful men in the world, giving a direct order to suppress public discourse about state violence. Not because it was false, or hateful, or dangerous, but because it was bad for the brand. It's hurting the stock. Bury it until the heat dies down. That line now lived in the congressional record. And no matter how Musk twisted in his seat, no matter how many PR firms or legal teams scrambled behind the scenes, he could not pull it back. The room remained frozen, and the silence this time wasn't one of uncertainty. It was reverence. Because sometimes truth doesn't land like a bomb, it lands like a bell and keeps ringing. The silence that followed Rivera's testimony was suffocating, not because it left anything unsaid, but because it said too much. The words were still echoing. Bury it until the heat dies down. When something visibly shifted in Elon Musk. His hands, which had gripped the edge of the table all morning like anchors, now began to twitch. His knee bounced once under the table. His breathing quickened, shallow and audible. And then, without warning, the crack became a break. He lurched to his feet like a man who had just realized the walls weren't just closing in. They had already locked. His voice exploded into the chamber, cracking like a whip, sharp with panic and humiliation. That's a lie. She was fired for incompetence. His face had flushed red, but not with rage. It was something else, something messier. Desperation, unfiltered and unstrategic. He slammed a palm against the table, as if that alone could hold together what was rapidly collapsing. His other hand gestured furiously in Rivera's direction, but she didn't move. She didn't flinch. She sat with the stillness of someone who had long ago surrendered her fear. And now her silence only amplified his unraveling. The room didn't react, not because it wasn't shocking, but because it was expected. The powerful always scream when their authority is pierced by a fact they can't delete. Musk scanned the committee, searching for allies, but none of the usual expressions greeted him. The faces staring back weren't those of admirers or supporters. They were masks of stone. Neutral, yes, but underneath you could feel it. A collective shift. The myth was bleeding. And Jasmine Crockett, she hadn't even stood. She sat still for a breath longer than necessary, letting his outburst hang in the air like a cigarette burned down to the filter. Then calmly she turned to her staffer, who passed her a small remote with the kind of precision that only comes when something has been prepared for this exact moment. She rose, not with force, not with anger, but with certainty, the kind of certainty that doesn't need to announce itself, because it is the room now. She looked Musk dead in the eye. Then what about this video? She didn't blink. She didn't look around for approval. She pressed play. The screens mounted around the chamber flickered to life. Every single one synced to the same footage. A Zoom meeting interface filled the displays, time-stamped and tagged with internal X metadata. Multiple squares, multiple executives. And there, unmistakable in the top corner, sat Elon Musk. Black t-shirt, jaw set, tone dismissive. The audio kicked in instantly. I don't care about justice. I care about engagement. The sentence didn't just drop. It detonated. There was no ambiguity in his voice. No sarcasm. No joking context. Just a flat, clean admission delivered to a room of subordinates who had said nothing back. And now in this hearing chamber, everyone heard what they hadn't been meant to hear. The air grew heavier with every passing second, not because people didn't understand, but because they did. What Musk had tried to paint as censorship had now revealed itself as commerce. What he had called freedom of expression was exposed as a metric, and what he had insisted was principle had just been revealed as profit dressed in a moral disguise. He stood motionless, still on his feet, but his presence had shrunk. His jaw twitched. His hands had stopped moving. The fight, so frantic only moments ago, had been replaced by something colder. Recognition. The truth had spoken, and this time it had his face, his voice, and his name on it. Jasmine said nothing more. She didn't have to. The room had already heard enough. The sentence had dropped, and the air hadn't recovered. I don't care about justice. I care about engagement. That voice, his voice, still echoed in the walls, even as the footage faded into black. Elon Musk remained standing, but it was as if the floor beneath him had vanished. The weight of the lie he had been carrying all day now settled on his shoulders in full view of the committee. And he knew, everyone knew, it was no longer a question of what he had said. It was a question of what would be done about it. Then from the back of the chamber, a new sound emerged. Not another voice in debate, not another outburst, a voice of authority. Cold, official, final. The FBI has opened a federal investigation. A sealed warrant for data seizure is being executed. Every head in the chamber turned toward the rear entrance, where two figures in dark suits had just entered. They moved with quiet urgency, not dramatic, not hostile, but precise, practiced. The silver badge hanging from one agent's lanyard caught the light for only a second before it disappeared beneath his jacket again. The murmurs died instantly. The two agents didn't approach Musk directly. They didn't issue commands. They didn't raise their voices. Instead, one stepped toward the end of the long mahogany hearing table and calmly handed a sealed envelope to Elon's lead counsel, his hand visibly shaking as he accepted it. The bold black letters on the front read, United States District Court, sealed data warrant. The second agent, holding a slim black case, placed it on the ground at Musk's feet. Not a briefcase, not a weapon. A secure digital intake unit, standard procedure for tech-based seizures. It was all happening in silence, with terrifying efficiency. Elon didn't move. His eyes flicked to the case, then the envelope, then to the agents. And for the first time, the man who had spent the last decade treating subpoenas like spam mail was facing the reality that no algorithm could suppress. This was no longer a hearing. It was an inflection point, and Jasmine Crockett understood that more than anyone in the room. She stood slowly, just enough for her voice to rise with clarity, but not with volume. She didn't perform. She spoke, steady, controlled, final. You're not under arrest, she said, every syllable as sharp as a blade being unsheathed. But for the first time, your power is going to be audited. The line didn't need to be loud. It carried the weight of law, morality, and long-suppressed outrage. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, and it pierced deeper than handcuffs ever could. Around her, the committee members, many of whom had stayed neutral all morning, now sat upright, alert, as if gravity itself had shifted in the room. Phones had been silenced. Notebooks had stopped flipping. Even the stenographer paused her typing. No one breathed too loudly. No one dared to interrupt what had become more than a moment. It was history unfolding in real time. Musk finally looked at Crockett, really looked at her, no longer as an opponent, no longer as a nuisance, but as the woman who had done what his army of lawyers, publicists, engineers, and influencers couldn't prepare for, cut through the myth of him. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again. No denial could undo what had been heard. No insult could discredit what had been played. And the envelope now sitting in his lawyer's trembling hand was not political. It was procedural, judicial, federal. Across the room, Caitlin Rivera sat in silence, her gaze steady, her face pale but unmoved. She hadn't flinched when Musk called her incompetent. She hadn't reacted when the video played, but now with the FBI present and the record sealed, she allowed herself a single, controlled breath. She had spoken. Jasmine had delivered. And the system, at least today, had answered. The agents didn't linger. They didn't speak to Musk again. Their work was done for now. The warrant had been served. The hardware had been handed off. And the process, long, grinding, inevitable, had begun. But the hearing chamber didn't exhale. No one felt relief. Only stillness. Because everyone understood what this really meant. This wasn't about just one man. It wasn't about just one platform. It wasn't even about one hearing. This was a mirror held up to power, and the reflection had finally cracked. Jasmine stood perfectly still at her microphone, her hands folded in front of her, as if anchoring herself through the tremor that had just torn through the room. She had walked into this hearing knowing the odds were stacked, knowing the smear campaign would come, that her past post would be weaponized, that her composure would be tested. But she had done it anyway. And now, in the aftermath of her question, her video, her voice, there were no more headlines to distract from the truth. No more algorithmic shields. No more carefully engineered narratives. Just a man, a room, a warrant, and a voice that finally made them all matter. The chairman cleared his throat once, but said nothing. The agents exited quietly, the door clicking shut behind them, with a sound that felt heavier than thunder. The moment had passed, but its weight remained. No one in that chamber, not the staffers, not the aides, not the senior representatives, would forget what had just happened. Because power, for the first time in a long time, had been forced to pause. Jasmine finally stepped back from the microphone. She didn't smile. She didn't claim victory. She simply turned off her mic and sat back down, slowly, calmly, and with the posture of someone who had carried far more than evidence today. She had carried memory, history, and justice, and she had delivered it, not with fury, but with truth. And now, the silence in that room said it all. For the first time in Elon Musk's public life, no one was defending him. No one dared, not even him. The agents had left, and the chamber had returned to stillness. But it wasn't peace. It was a silence so thick it felt like pressure on the chest. Papers lay untouched. The video feed screens had gone black. And Elon Musk, once the towering figure in the room, now sat slouched, blinking too fast, his hands twitching on the tabletop as if trying to grab hold of a reality slipping through his fingers. He hadn't said a word since the FBI agents walked out. But now something broke. He shifted forward suddenly, pushing his chair back with a scrape and waving his hand in the air, like he was swatting away smoke. "Can we take a break?" he said, his voice cracking at the edges. 5 minutes. I need a recess." No one answered. He stood, tried again, more forcefully this time. "We need to stop this, just for a moment. I want a recess. 10 minutes. 15. His tone was rising, not in authority, but in desperation. It wasn't a request. It was the pleading of a man cornered by his own reflection. His legal team remained frozen, uncertain whether to support or distance. Behind him, one aide silently closed the laptop still glowing with Crockett's damning screenshots. Musk's face was pale now, the flush of arrogance long gone. He looked toward the chairman, then to the committee, then to no one in particular. "I need a break," he muttered again, this time barely above a whisper. A centrist congressman near the end of the panel, older and known for rarely taking sides, leaned toward the mic and offered a gentle escape hatch. "Mr. Chairman, perhaps we allow a 10-minute recess to collect." But before he could finish, Jasmine Crockett stood. No theatrics, no raised voice, just unwavering focus and the kind of moral clarity that doesn't ask permission. "I don't break," she said firmly, eyes never leaving Musk. "Not when the truth is burning." Her voice carried not just conviction, but weariness, the kind of tired that only comes from carrying stories the world keeps trying to erase. She wasn't grandstanding. She was refusing to look away. And with those 8 words, the entire room remembered why they were here. Musk didn't sit. He remained standing, lost somewhere between command and collapse, his mouth half open as if caught mid-thought, mid-regret, mid-realization that something was happening he could no longer control. And Jasmine, who had waited patiently all day for this exact moment, turned the page. "I'm submitting a supplemental exhibit," she said, motioning to the aide beside her. Internal analytics from X's Trust and Safety Division. These were obtained by a whistleblower after the 2022 algorithm restructuring. The screen behind her lit up again. Bar graphs, heat maps, hashtag suppression lists. But it wasn't just data, it was a confession in numbers. In the 12 months following the restructuring, she continued, posts containing terms associated with Black activism, such as Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, Stop Cop City, saw a 74% reduction in visibility. Not because of hate speech violations, not because of flag content, but because of internal classification as high risk for brand safety. She turned a page. Posts referencing immigration rights, particularly those using Spanish-language phrases like Unidos Somos Más or Abolish ICE, were deprioritized at a 62% rate under the same classification. She paused. Let it sink in. This wasn't algorithmic neutrality, she said. It was algorithmic erasure. Gasps didn't fill the room, but jaws clenched. The committee, many of whom had once played polite with tech executives, now sat with shoulders drawn tight, their hands frozen halfway through note-taking. This wasn't abstract anymore. These were not mistakes of scale. These were patterns of choice. Musk looked up slowly. Something in him had shifted. The veneer had shattered already, but now even the fragments were falling away. He didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He just sat down, hard, like the weight of what had been exposed was finally too heavy to carry with posture. Then he did something no one in that room had seen him do all day. He dropped his face into both hands, not like a man hiding from light, like a man realizing it was never going to turn off again. The billionaire who had walked in with a smirk and a soundbite was now hunched forward like someone absorbing a sentence. Not a legal one, not yet, but a moral one. His empire had built the platform, but Jasmine Crockett had stripped away the curtain, and all that was left was a man in retreat. The room didn't move. No one whispered. No one shuffled. Not even the stenographer resumed typing. Because something sacred had happened, something rare, a moment where power, for all its wealth and insulation, had been forced to feel what it had always deflected. And Jasmine? She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She stood alone, in full view of a system that had doubted her, demeaned her, tried to distract her, and now finally was forced to listen. Because when truth burns that bright, the room doesn't get to look away. Not anymore. The air in the chamber had shifted from pressure to paralysis. Elon Musk sat, unmoving, his hands pressed together in a half-prayer, half-shield just beneath his chin. He looked neither at the committee nor at his counsel. His gaze was fixed downward, unblinking, as if what had just happened, the video, the FBI, the numbers, had sucked the color out of the room, and now he was watching the ground split open beneath his feet. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She stood with the gravity of someone not delivering a blow, but lowering the final stone on a sealed tomb. She stepped up to the microphone one last time. The movement alone turned heads, subtle but absolute. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, each step as deliberate as a verdict approaching its reading. Her hands, steady all morning, now clasped the edge of the wooden table, not for balance but to command stillness. She didn't scan the room. She didn't even look at Elon. She just spoke. You use technology to control the truth, but I use the truth to control you. The line didn't explode. It reverberated. Slow, cold, clean, like a razor drawn across years of unchecked power. Like the final sentence in a court transcript that would one day be studied in constitutional law classes. And the moment it left her lips, the energy in the room changed, not toward rage, not toward applause, but toward respect. The kind of respect that doesn't make noise. It stands. A low, instinctive rustle swept through the room. One by one, people rose from their chairs. No one spoke. No one moved quickly. There was no choreography. It was simply appropriate. Even members of the committee who had not spoken a word all day, who had danced around neutrality like it was their party line, now stood, not to side with a politician, but to acknowledge what had just taken place. Jasmine didn't bow. didn't thank them. She stayed still, hands braced on the table, as if grounding herself not in pride, but in gravity. Then she reached forward and picked up the slim legal folder she had kept closed since the beginning of the hearing. One simple manila envelope, creased at the edges, labeled in black marker. She opened it, withdrew a single signed document, and held it up. Not high, not for theater. Just high enough that no one could pretend they didn't see it. "I am formally recommending," she said, "that all materials, testimonies, and digital evidence submitted in this hearing be transferred immediately to the Department of Justice for independent investigation and potential criminal referral." Her tone was flat, devoid of any celebratory note. This wasn't triumph. This was duty, and it hit harder than any accusation that had come before it. Musk didn't move. The words landed on him like bricks, each one heavier than the last. He didn't turn to his attorneys. He didn't glance at the cameras that weren't even allowed in the room. He didn't try to interrupt, not this time. He simply sat, staring forward with the dull, unfocused eyes of someone who had just discovered the floor was gone beneath him and the free fall had already begun. A motion passed from Jasmine's hand to a staffer, then across the panel, where the chair received it with visible tension in his fingertips. He didn't speak either, he simply nodded. One short, final movement, enough to make it official. Somewhere in the back, a staff member exhaled too loudly and immediately caught themselves, because no one in the room dared break the moment. Jasmine stepped away from the microphone. That alone was enough to finish the hearing, but the room still wasn't breathing, and Elon Musk, once the orchestrator of attention, the king of headlines, the avatar of algorithmic influence, remained seated, unmoving, like a machine that had finally overheated and shut down. His fingers twitched faintly over the table surface. He wasn't restrained, he wasn't under arrest, but he was trapped, not by the FBI, by reality. He tried once to lift his eyes. They landed on no one, and that was when one of his aides rushed forward, clearly uncertain, clearly improvising. The man moved like someone who wanted to be useful, but knew it was too late. In his hand, a cold bottle of water, beads of condensation already running down the sides. He placed it gently on the table beside Elon, leaned in, whispered something. Something no one could hear. Elon didn't react. He didn't nod. He didn't touch the bottle. The label glared under the overhead lights, untouched, like everything else he once controlled, now inert. Because what was left to swallow? What spin? What explanation? What PR memo could be sipped now that every truth had been said out loud, recorded, witnessed, filed? There was nothing left to absorb, nothing left to deflect. And that was the cost. Not handcuffs, not yet. But something heavier, isolation. The kind that doesn't come from being removed, but from realizing that every version of yourself, the billionaire, the innovator, the disruptor, has been outlived by a single sentence you could never take back. I don't care about justice. I care about engagement. And that voice, the voice that once commanded stock markets, had now rendered him small, not because it was loud, but because it had been true. Crockett sat back down slowly, her spine straight, her gaze still fixed ahead. She didn't whisper, didn't gloat. She simply pressed her hands together, placed them on the table, and breathed. It was over. But more than that, it had happened, and now the world beyond those doors would never see him the same way again. Because the truth, once spoken in rooms like this, does not ask permission to leave. It walks out on its own, and it takes the myth with it. Outside the Capitol, the storm had already begun. By the time the hearing room door clicked shut behind the last staffer, the headlines had detonated. There was no press conference, no public statement, just one name, one phrase, and one leak that spread like fire in a drought. Elon Musk under federal criminal investigation. Within minutes, the words blanketed every major outlet. CNN broke it first with a banner graphic and a one-line update. MSNBC followed, then Reuters, then the BBC. Across oceans in different languages, the same headline twisted itself through 1,000 digital veins, reaching every phone, every screen, every boardroom that had once treated his tweets as scripture. Hashtag after hashtag erupted, but one soared above the rest. Jasmine vs. Elon. It started as a whisper, a single thread posted by a civil rights attorney from Detroit who screen recorded Jasmine's closing line and uploaded it raw. No edit, no filter, just 7 seconds of Crockett staring directly into the soul of power and saying, "You use technology to control the truth, but I use the truth to control you." The post exploded, retweeted by activists, celebrities, tech critics, and journalists. By the time the East Coast reached mid-afternoon, it was the #1 trend on the planet. Not a meme, not a scandal, a moment, a reckoning dressed as a quote. The kind of sentence that no one could scroll past because it didn't just apply to Musk, it applied to everything. Cable news hosts tried to scramble live panels. Commentators were caught off guard, forced to confront not just what had happened, but how it happened. This wasn't a staged takedown. It wasn't a partisan trap. It was something purer and more dangerous to the status quo. A woman, in a room full of silence, who refused to be edited out. Reddit blew up. Subforums that typically worship Musk fractured in real time. Some tried to defend him. Others posted the video, the email, the whistleblower statement, the Zoom quote, and simply captioned it, "This isn't innovation. This is manipulation." And then in the middle of the viral chaos came the quote that no one expected, posted by a third-year law student from Howard University, posted without fame, without filters, without intention of going viral, just truth. Crockett didn't just question Musk. She questioned an entire century where power always beat reason. Within 15 minutes, it was on every major Instagram story of every progressive publication. Within an hour, it was printed on signs in front of Twitter's San Francisco office. By dusk, it had been turned into a mural, spray painted on the side of a bookstore in Oakland, in bold, slanted type beneath a black and white still of Jasmine Crockett at the microphone. Meanwhile, inside the Capitol, the hearing room had gone still. The chairs were empty. The documents had been collected. The lights were dimmed, but not fully turned off. The echo of the day still lingered in the corners, where the aides had whispered, where Musk had broken, where the truth had first entered and refused to leave. Jasmine stood alone now. She hadn't left immediately like the others. She didn't rush into a media scrum. She didn't take the elevator down into the roar of flashbulbs and shouted questions. She stayed behind. Her hands rested on the table's edge. She looked around, not at the power, not at the nameplates, not at the microphones, but at the silence. And then, very quietly, to no one but herself, she spoke. "There will be more hearings." A pause, a breath. But today, the truth had the mic. Her voice didn't need an audience. It wasn't for the internet. It wasn't for the cameras. It was for the ghosts that usually sit in rooms like this. Uninvited, unheard. The ghosts of women silenced, of whistleblowers buried, of truth drowned beneath titles, bank accounts, and procedural shrugs. The ghosts of "you're overreacting," of "you'll lose your future if you say that," of "he's too big to challenge." And in that quiet chamber, for the first time in decades, those ghosts had been given voice, not to haunt, to witness. Jasmine slowly packed her notes, her pen, her folder. Her hands didn't shake, her eyes didn't glisten. She had trained herself long ago to be calm in the aftermath, not because she didn't feel, but because she had learned the world doesn't allow women like her to show the impact of carrying history. She stepped out into the hallway. Behind her, the hearing room lights dimmed to black. Before her, a line of staffers waiting silently. And down the hall, the storm. The world had already changed. It didn't know it yet, but it had. Not because Elon Musk had fallen, but because Jasmine Crockett had stood. But even as the echo of her words faded into the marble bones of the Capitol, something deeper was unfolding. Quieter than headlines, slower than hashtags, but infinitely more lasting. The lesson. Because moments like this, moments when power stumbles and truth doesn't, don't just change laws or reputations. They change people, one by one, silently, irreversibly. And for anyone watching, for anyone who had ever felt outnumbered, underestimated, or overwritten, the hearing wasn't just political theater. It was a mirror, a dare, a human turning point. Not because Jasmine Crockett humiliated Elon Musk, but because she didn't let herself be deleted. She had walked into that chamber carrying generations of silence on her back. Every time she was interrupted, every time her past posts were weaponized, every time a billionaire tried to reduce her to a headline, she absorbed it, not with passivity, but with purpose. She didn't scream. She didn't fold. She sharpened. And that alone was the most human act of all. Because when the world tells you to shrink and you choose instead to stand taller, it's not ego. It's survival. That's the part most people will miss. This was never just about Musk's misdeeds or algorithmic corruption. It was about the quiet violence of being unheard. It was about what happens when truth has to crawl through locked doors, buried data, secret emails, and billion-dollar barricades just to be taken seriously. It was about how hard it still is in 2025 for a woman of color to walk into a room built to silence her and refuse to stay quiet. And that's the point. Power doesn't fear chaos, it fears clarity. Musk had chaos on his side. Talking points, engineers, lobbyists, media shields. But Jasmine brought clarity. One sentence at a time. One document at a time. One stare that never blinked. And in a world addicted to noise, clarity is lethal. The truth didn't scream that day. It stood still, and it made everyone else listen. But the cost of that stillness? It's rarely shown. It's not in the headlines or the trending tags. It's in the fatigue behind her eyes when the cameras shut off. In the weight of every whispered threat that never makes it into press coverage. In the inboxes flooded with hate masked as opinion. That's what justice looks like when you're on the front line. Not glorious, not clean, but relentless. Because here's the hardest truth of all. You don't win by being louder. You win by being undeniable. And Jasmine Crockett was undeniable not because she outshouted Musk, but because she outlasted every attempt to silence her. When they laughed, she wrote. When they deflected, she listened. When they dismissed her, she documented. She wasn't trying to go viral. She was trying to be exact. There's something almost violent in how subtle that strategy was. No drama, just receipts. And in doing so, she taught us something else. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive in a roar. It arrives in a woman calmly reading from a folder and watching a billionaire fold. That is what broke the spell. Not her anger, her precision, not her rage, her refusal to be erased. And what's more human than that? We all know what it feels like to be silenced, to be overlooked in rooms where we did the work, but someone else got the mic. To watch people in power tell half-truths while the rest of us bleed in the margins. We know what it's like to carry receipts no one wants to read, to say things that cost us relationships, opportunities, safety. Jasmine Crockett didn't destroy Musk. She showed the world what it takes to speak truth to power when power has a microphone the size of the internet. And in doing so, she taught us the most terrifyingly hopeful thing of all. They're not untouchable. They're just used to not being touched. So what now? Now you act. In whatever space you occupy, you act not out of guilt, but out of clarity. Out of the understanding that justice doesn't trickle from the Supreme Court down. It rises from classrooms, from courtrooms, from conversations where people finally stop editing their truth to keep others comfortable. It rises when you challenge a sentencing policy that's buried under bureaucratic jargon. When you vote in local elections that appoint judges with unchecked power. When you ask why Black teenagers are labeled threats, while white ones are called troubled. And when you refuse to accept that silence equals civility. You act by learning the names of the judges on your ballot, not just the celebrities on the bench. You look up their records. You attend school board meetings where disciplinary policies are often early blueprints for courtroom disparities. You listen, especially to the stories that don't end with perfect victims or clear heroes. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.